The story I'm going to tell concerns a friend of mine, Eddie. He has always been a man who preferred to spend time alone. He adored the solitude and silence of his country house, and this habit of his only intensified after his wife left for work in another city. But what happened on one of his solitary evenings made him reconsider all his views on loneliness and security. Eddie was a practical and reasonable man. When his wife went on a business trip, he was glad to have the opportunity to enjoy peace and quiet. His house, located on the outskirts surrounded by forests and fields, was his ideal refuge. It was an old two-story house with a large attic and basement, which he rarely used, but kept in order anyway. In the evening, when she left, Eddie closed the house and cooked himself dinner, setting himself up to spend the evening reading and watching an old movie. At night, after he had locked all the windows and doors and sat down in his armchair by the fireplace, everything seemed perfectly calm. Gradually, as silence engulfed the house, Eddie began to notice strange things. At first, he thought it was just the sounds of an old house, rustling, cracking wood, moving air. But then he began to notice more disturbing things. At first, he heard a strange noise coming from the basement. They were some kind of distant, muffled sounds, could not be explained by the simple movement of pipes or old wiring. At first, he ignored it, assuming it could be some kind of animal trapped. But the sound was too rhythmic and insistent. Eddie decided to check the basement to make sure everything was in order. He took a flashlight and, going down the stairs, found that there was nothing unusual there. Old household appliances, tools, dusty boxes, everything was in its place. The only thing that seemed strange to him was that one of the boxes, which he remembered that he had never touched, was slightly open. Eddie closed it and, going back up to the first floor, decided that it was just an accident. In the evening, Eddie went to bed but couldn't sleep. He kept hearing strange sounds. Sometimes it was a creaking, sometimes a barely audible tapping. He thought that it might just be his imagination playing with him, because of loneliness. However, the sounds continued all night. The next morning, when Eddie was getting ready for breakfast, he noticed that the basement door was ajar, although he remembered that he had closed it last night. He thought he might have accidentally left it open and went on about his business, but by evening he noticed that the door was open again. He began to worry and decided to put a lock on it, so as not to worry about what might be happening. The next night, after he put the lock on, Eddie went back to sleep, but this time his anxiety did not leave him. His sleep was intermittent, and he often woke up listening to the sounds in the house. In the middle of the night, he heard a dull, grinding sound coming from the basement. Eddie got up, took the flashlight, and headed downstairs. This time, he was sure that he had heard something more than just a noise. When he went down to the basement, he found that the lock on the door was broken and the door itself was open. Eddie turned on the flashlight and illuminated the room, but found nothing suspicious. He did a thorough inspection of the basement, but everything looked the same as before. Closed the door again and returned to the ground floor, flustered. That night, Eddie fell asleep with the flashlight turned on next to him, but that didn't help either. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he was woken up again by a strange sound. This time, it was a sharp, piercing sound, reminiscent of the creaking of a door. He jumped out of bed and saw that his bedroom was flooded with moonlight. The window he remembered closed was open. Eddie closed the window and went back to bed, but his anxiety was growing. It seemed that every rustle, every slightest movement of the air caused his heart to beat faster. He felt out of place, as if his home was no longer a safe haven. The silence he had once enjoyed was now becoming his enemy. Few minutes have passed, and here it is again. As soon as he lay down, he heard a sound coming from the living room. It was like a thud, as if someone had moved or knocked over something. Eddie took the flashlight again, and without turning on the main light, went out into the corridor. Everything in the living room looked as he had left it, except for one thing. The armchair in which he was sitting by the fireplace was slightly turned around. At first glance, it might have seemed that he had left it like that, but Eddie knew that when he went to bed, it was turned towards the fireplace. An unpleasant feeling arose inside, as if someone was watching him. someone who knew his habits but carefully avoided being noticed. He checked the doors and windows on the ground floor. Everything was locked. How could this happen? Perhaps he was just tired and it was all a figment of his imagination. But even so, his mind was restless. The next day passed in a blur. Eddie felt exhausted after a night of intermittent disturbing awakenings. But as soon as the evening twilight came, he felt the inner tension again. Something was bothering him. He checked the house again, locked all the doors and windows, but this time he decided to do something else. He set up several traps at night. Small threads and simple motion sensors to see if someone was moving around the house while he was sleeping. The night began quietly. Eddie checked every corner and went to bed. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, he was woken up by a strange sound. It was a sharp crack, as if something had hit the floor. He sat up abruptly in bed, trying to figure out what was going on. Silence rang in his ears, but his nerves were on edge. Eddie got up slowly and turned on the flashlight. First of all, he checked the traps. The thread he had strung in the doorway to the kitchen was torn. Someone or something passed by her. The motion sensor he had installed in the hallway went off. LED was flashing, signaling movement. The anxiety was growing. Felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. As Eddie climbed the stairs to the attic, he heard a floorboard creak below. But at that moment, all his thoughts were focused on the attic. He didn't go up there very often, and the attic itself always seemed like an eerie place to him. Dust, old things that had been stored there for years, rusty tools. However, lately, this place seemed to have become a source of concern for him. It was as if something strange was being observed or accumulated. To his surprise, nothing was disturbed in the attic. But there was an unbearable silence, so dense that it could be felt. There were no drafts on this floor, no old windows that could open. But this silence was strange. He seemed to be hiding, watching him. He went downstairs and checked the kitchen. His trap was useless again. The thread was torn, but there were no traces or other signs of presence. Eddie began to doubt his sanity. Eddie didn't fall asleep that night. He spent the rest of the night sitting on a chair in the living room, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. When morning came, he realized that he had to do something. Eddie decided not to put it off. He spent the whole day trying to find an explanation for what had been happening to him in recent days. He reviewed the house plan, checked old blueprints, trying to figure out if there might be something hidden there that he had missed. Perhaps there was a secret passage somewhere in the walls, maybe an old ventilation system through which animals entered. But nothing suspicious was found. He began to think that it was just his overwork and nerves. Left alone in a large house, a person could easily begin to see and hear things that are not there. However, the sounds, the movement, was all too real. At night, he set up cameras all over the house again, setting them up so that they record all the small movements. This time, he wasn't going to miss a single shot. When night fell, the house seemed to be hiding. The silence was so oppressive that it seemed almost deafening. Eddie went to bed, but he didn't even try to sleep. He kept his phone handy to check the cameras at any moment. His nerves were stretched like strings. Time passed slowly, minute by minute, hour by hour. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he heard a creaking sound. It was the same sound that had become familiar to him, as if someone was moving cautiously around the house. This time, Eddie didn't leave the room. Instead, he turned on the camera installed in the hallway. And this time he saw what he had been expecting with a sinking heart: the shadow. On his phone screen, something was moving in the dark, slowly, almost noiselessly. It passed by the hallway and moved towards the living room. Eddie peered at the screen, trying to make out something specific, but the image was too blurry. The shadow moved cautiously, as if it knew it was being watched. Eddie's heart began to pound even harder. It could no longer be a trick of the light or just his imagination. Something or someone was in his house. He decided to check out another camera, the one that was installed in the basement. He clicked on the screen, and a few seconds later, a picture opened up in front of him. The basement was empty. But as Eddie thought about it, something in the background caught his eye. The door to the small room was ajar again, the very place where he found the strange box a few days ago. Unable to stand it any longer, He took the flashlight and went downstairs again. His hands were shaking, but he knew he had to figure out what was going on. The basement door was open again. Pulling himself together, he went down into the cold room. Every cell in his body screamed that this was a bad idea. He couldn't stop. Basement was full of heavy, musty air. This time it was a little different, as if something had changed in the house. Eddie heard a noise behind him, a short, sharp sound, as if someone had slammed a door. Turning around, he saw that the door to the basement had indeed closed. But none of this was as scary as what he saw next. There was a piece of paper on the floor next to that drawer. It was an old, faded newspaper, but the headline on it made him feel cold. The disappearance of the Flint family, a mystery that has not been solved for decades. Eddie froze. He remembered that he had heard about this story as a child. The house he lived in once belonged to a family that disappeared without a trace many years ago. No one ever found out what happened to them. The house stood empty for several years before Eddie's parents bought it. With each new thought, my heart was pounding harder. Picked up the newspaper, flipped through it, and on one of the last pages he saw a photograph, an old black and white image of the Flint family. There was something eerily familiar about those faces. Eddie remembered seeing similar features in old photographs in this house, but he never thought about who it was. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. The basement was empty. The sound was clear. Turned around sharply, but saw no one. But steps stopped. Eddie felt a chill run through his body. He was almost certain that someone was standing behind him, watching,